Our next topic is developing and implementing vulnerability management. Vulnerability management is the process of identifying, evaluating, treating, and reporting on security vulnerabilities in systems and softwares that run on them. This, implemented alongside with other security tactics, is vital for organizations to prioritize for minimizing attack surface risk. To talk more about this topic, we have Mo Hassan from USA, who is a cybersecurity architect at Department of Transportation, New York City. He has 2 decades of diversified IT experience, initiated and orchestrated many complex IT projects from beginning to end. Moreover, he has engaged multiple parties and developed outstanding results exceeding any expectation, and provided guidance, briefed, advised executive on status and policies for the organizations. So, Mr. Mo Hassan, would you please join us? You have about 60 minutes to complete your session. So please introduce yourself and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Cheyenne. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can all hear you.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. So, well, hi, everybody. Welcome. And I'm very glad to be here at this presentation. And thank you so much for being here and also for inviting me. So as Cheyenne introduced, I am Mo Hassan. 2 decades of experience. I have worked in many different industries, different areas of focus. Also, I've worked in system administration, security, virtualization, storage, and a bunch of other areas. Worked with various clients in New York City as well as out of state. In addition to my 2 decades of experience, I hold industry certifications from GIÁC and Comptia. Okay, and I'm also teaching here in New York City. So that's a bit of about myself, and with that, I will get started. Let's see. I hope you can see my screen, Cheyenne, and everybody else.
We can see your screen. Yes, please continue.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so vulnerability sounds fun, right? Is it good or bad? Right. So to understand vulnerability, we have to understand the fundamentals of it. What does it mean to be vulnerable? Like, what does it? We have to get a solid understanding of what it is, right? Or what are the risks, right? So in order to better understand vulnerability management program, we have to start with the basic, the most basic definition, and that includes threat, vulnerability, and risk. So what is a threat? So a threat is basically anything that can cause harm. Threats can come in many shape and form. It's not always man-made. It could be natural as well. It could be a technical thing. In other words, anything that could potentially cause a harm. So that is a threat. It could be an individual. It could be a technical thing, right? It could be a natural disaster. We'll go into more details. So a threat is a new incident with potential to harm systems. Anything that inflicts damage, right? So anything that basically that causes disruption in services or something that causes loss of revenue, right? Basically anything that causes harm is considered a threat. So we'll go into more details about that. A vulnerability, that's the focus of our discussion. The vulnerability in simple sense is a weakness in your system. So if you leave your door open in the house, that's a vulnerability because that is a weakness, right? So with that open door, anybody could just walk in, right? So that is a weakness. So in order to strengthen the security, we lock our door, right? Sometimes we put double doors and other barriers, right? So because we want to minimize our risk, we don't want anybody to just walk into our house, right? So that is our focus. So again, going back to vulnerability is a weakness in our system. So these are weak spots within your environment and your assets. Weaknesses that open you up to potential threats and increased risk. So when your system is vulnerable, that increases your chance of being compromised, right? So when compromises happen, as we know, they can cause financial damage, reputation, right? Not to mention disruption, right? And as we can see, These days, threat landscape has changed drastically. Pretty much everyone is a target, right? And one of the primary ways we fall victims of these incidents is by having vulnerable systems. Okay. Now, risk is you can think of risk as the result of when vulnerabilities are exploited, right? So it is a function of the other two variables. What happens, right? What happens if my systems are compromised? That is the risk, right? So the risk is the result of somebody exploiting your vulnerabilities. So risk is the potential for loss, damage, or destruction of an asset when threat takes advantage of the vulnerability. So risk is what basically connects the other two variables in the scenario, right? So a threat actor or a threat element exploits a vulnerability within your system, right? And by doing that, it causes a disruption, right? So that is the risk you're potentially facing. So this risk could be in terms of money. It could be in terms of reputation, of course, right? Because that's reputation is very, very important for everybody, right? Because if once you lose your reputation, it's very hard to gain your reputation back, because monetary loss you can make up for it with the, if your sales are higher next year or something, right? You can make up for that, but loss of reputation, it's kind of hard to get back. So that is a big concern. And also recently, hackers are also targeting health facilities, utilities, and that's a big concern, because this could actually potentially kill somebody, right? So if you think about it, this is very a risky thing, and why security matters, right? Okay. So now that we have a basic understanding of those terms, let's try to visualize, right? Let's try to think about this scenario here. So in this picture, we see some nails on the road, right? And we see a tire, right? Now, in this case, the tire happens to be a decade old, 10-year-old. So that means it's pretty old, right? A 10-year-old tire. It's not as good as a brand new one, of course, right? So if you're driving over those nails, chances are it will impact the tire, right? As a result, you may get a flat tire, right? Which will then cause your car to stall, right? So in this case, those nails, right? So nails are the threats in this case, right? Because they can cause damage, right? And my vulnerability is that tire, which happens to be 10 years old, right? And that's what makes them more vulnerable than a, let's say, brand new tire. Right? A brand new tire will be able to handle that threat a bit better. It's not ideal situation, but a bit better than a 10-year-old tire, right? So, and because of that reduced vulnerability probability, right? The risk also varies, right? The older your system is, the risk would be higher in that case, right? So this is how they're interconnected, right? So threat is, again, something that could cause harm, right? A vulnerability is a weakness in your system, and the risk is the result of those threats exploiting or taking advantage of those vulnerabilities. Okay. So let's look at into threats a bit more, right? So threats are capabilities or methods of attack developed by malicious entities to exploit vulnerabilities and potentially cause harm to a computer system or network. So vulnerability, threats come in many shape and form. As you can see, they could be natural. It could be unintentional too, right? And most likely they're intentional. So natural threats, some of the examples include tornadoes, floods, hurricanes. So it's basically an act of God, right? Something that we have no control over, right? We don't control when there's going to be next earthquake or the hurricane, right? So this is beyond our control. but it is a threat nonetheless, right? So depending on the value of your asset, we need to design our system so that even in the case of a natural threat, right, we can withstand and continue to run our business. Unintentional threats include, an employee mistakenly accessing the wrong information. I mean, that is just one example. People fall victim of phishing attacks all the time, right? So that's pretty important because you can spend a lot of money on fancy tools, very expensive, complicated, sophisticated tools. But if a user falls victim of a simple phishing attack, that sort of nullifies all those other controls and negates the value of them, right? Because now your environment is compromised. So there is no substitute for user education. This is super important. You want to train your user, on this basic cybersecurity hygiene, so that they don't fall victim of the simple yet effective attacks, right? And they don't need to be cybersecurity experts. There are a lot of training modules that are very effective, simple to understand. So that is a big weakness in many organizations, lack of education, lack of security awareness. So that, this way you don't have to deal with any sort of unintentional threats, or hopefully your users won't fall victim of such phishing attacks. Intentional threats are, when somebody is deliberately targeting your organization, right? So this includes the typical spyware, malware, adware, the actions of a disgruntled employee, right? So that could be a threat too, right? Because remember, it's not always somebody outside of your organization. It's not always the bad guy outside. It could be an internal employee, a disgruntled employee, somebody who's not happy. They could potentially cause damage also. So we need to be mindful of that scenario, right? It's not always the guy outside. As mentioned, vulnerability is a weakness or a defect or bug that allows an external entity to directly or indirectly influence the availability, reliability, confidentiality, or integrity of system and application and data, right? So when vulnerabilities are exploited, these three elements can be disrupted one way or the other, right? So availability, in short, means systems will be available as requested. Confidentiality means there's a certain level of privacy and protection embedded, so that not everybody can read data when they're not supposed to. And integrity means it hasn't been tampered with, right? So there are many different ways that can be ensured. But when a vulnerability is exploited, chances are one of these three elements will be compromised, and as a result of that, there's a disruption of some kind, right? So vulnerabilities can be exploited by a malicious entity to violate policies, for example, to gain greater access or permission than is authorized on a computer. So there's different targets, right? So different objectives. So sometimes malwares try to elevate their privilege to steal information. Sometimes they cause or damage to information. So it depends on the specifics, right, of the attacker. So what are some vulnerabilities, some examples of vulnerabilities? So one of the most common one is the outdated software. And that is a very, very common challenge at many organizations and companies I've worked with. It's very prevalent. Companies don't keep up with the software updates. That includes Windows primarily. So eventually what happens, Microsoft stops supporting them. Microsoft stops pushing updates for them, right? Like anything else, right? As we age, these things become more vulnerable. And to make it worse, the vendor stops supporting these products. So it's important to keep up with the changes in technology. We cannot set something up today and claim that this will be good for the next decade or so, right? We need to keep up with the changes and the updates. And also at the same time, make sure there's a patch management. We're managing patches well, right? The other challenge is unmanaged devices. With the COVID pandemic, we have seen an increase in remote work and work from home environment, right? And because of this is something, the first time we've ever experienced, there was a rush to equip employees with tools and technology. And because of that rush, things were not properly planned, right? So a lot of these devices were just simply sent out without being managed, right? So that means there was no proper asset management or inventory done. Maybe the security stack wasn't really set up, right? Because the primary objective was to get them back to work remotely, right? So security was an afterthought, which is unfortunate. And in addition, there can be software flaws as well, right? Some kind of logical gap or somewhere. In addition, the tool itself can be misconfigured as well. So there's a bunch of ways your system can be vulnerable. It's not just one thing that makes a system or software vulnerable. There's many possibilities, including using weak password. You could have a very sophisticated tool, but if you use a weak or simple password, that in itself is a vulnerability, right? Insider privilege misuse, right? So just because somebody has privilege, right? It's unfettered, right? It should be properly audited, monitored, so that it cannot be misused, or if it is misused, it should be caught in a reasonable manner, right? And bad guys are always looking for new exploits, right? Because as defenders, right, we have to get things right 100% of the time or every single time. From a hacker's perspective, they just need to get things one time, right? Because they'll try everything under the sun and see whatever sticks, right? Whichever method they're able to exploit and gain access into the environment. So as blue defenders, right, we have to get everything right, comprehensively cover all the areas, right? So bad guys are constantly researching for new exploits, as well as utilizing the current exploits that are available. Open ports, the mentality should be open up things as needed, right? Instead of opening up everything initially, it should be closed initially and open as needed. So that's a better secure approach, right? And human error, that's another vulnerability, because it's always remains a possibility, right? So let's now look into risk, right? So risk is a function of threat and vulnerability. So risk is basically the damage of threat and vulnerability. When a threat takes advantage of the vulnerability, what happens, right? So that is my risk, right? So risk is defined as the potential for loss or damage when a threat exploits a vulnerability. So this includes financial loss, loss of privacy, damage to your reputation. Sometimes there's legal implications too, right? So imagine if you deal with customer data, and these happens to be confidential, personalized data, such as names, addresses, phone numbers. Those are very private information, right? So if your systems are compromised and that information is leaked or exposed somehow, so that could cause there may be some legal implications for that, because now you'd be liable for that leak of information, right? And as I mentioned earlier, it could be loss of life too. I mean, these days hackers are getting very aggressive, and they're attacking without discrimination, right? So I think very recently here in Florida, thankfully that was not successful. They tried to attack a water treatment plant. So if they were successful, that would have caused major disruption. Imagine what happens, right, when your water supply is disrupted. You can imagine what would happen if a hospital was attacked, right? Or your power grid was attacked, right? So, I mean, these are very, very scary, but very real threats that, that exist, right? We need to be mindful of that. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want to be associated with any of these, right? And what are other risks that may exist, right? Obviously, this is just 5 examples, but there can be many, many other type of risks, right? So we need to decide, okay, do we need to be associated with this? And to what is the extent of our risk appetite, right? What up to how what level of risk we're accepting. So to give you an example, when you drive, right? Hope everybody drives carefully. When you drive, you for that privilege, right? You kind of have to accept that accident remains a potential, right? But we try to minimize by driving safe, right? By following the traffic signals, right? So by doing those activities, we reduce our chances, right, of accident, right? Therefore, we reduce the risk of getting to an accident, but it is a risk we accept by choosing to drive, right? So similar thing can be applicable here. When we run our IT shops, there's a certain element of risk involved in everything that we do, right? So we need to, this is why understanding the value of that asset is very, very important, right? So once you understand the value of that asset, you can appropriately design your security solution, right? So something that needs 10 technical controls versus something that needs just 1 or 2 technical controls, right? Because that other asset is worth much, much more, right? So you have to understand what the asset is, what is the value of that asset. So the vulnerability management program is a recurring thing. It's not just one thing. You plan it, you do it, and you're done, right? So this is a continuous thing. That's the important thing. So vulnerability management is not really a project, right? It's an operational thing. A project has a start and finish, right? Not the case with vulnerability management, right? So this is a continuous thing. So the first step is discovering, right? Asset management. You have to know what you have, right? So to give you some context, you go to your insurance guy and say, "Hey, guy, I want to insure my kids." I mean, the insurance guy says, "That's fantastic, right? How many kids do you have?" And then you have no answer. Right? And unfortunately, this is the reality in many IT shops, right? People just don't know what they have, or because of the environment is very complex or super large or something. But this is a real challenge. Fortunately, there are tools that can help you assess your assets, right? It'll take some time, but it's totally doable. So the first step is understanding your environment, discovering what you have, right? Once you have that insight, you want to prioritize, assess, and report on it, right? So once you get the report, the vulnerability report, now it's time to remediate them, right? To address those vulnerabilities. And then the last step is actually verifying them, right? Is your patch management actually working, right? Was it successful, right? So what is our vulnerability status now? Like, how does it look from January since now, right? So this is, you want to verify it, right? So starting with the discovery, you assess, prioritize, execute, and remediate, right? And then verify it. So why does it matter, right? So this is the part where you have to understand why we should care about vulnerability management, right? Why does it matter? What is the context? So this domain focuses on the process by which organizations identify, analyze, and manage vulnerabilities in a critical services operating system. Vulnerability assessment broaden and deepen awareness of threats, attacks, vulnerabilities, and the effectiveness of existing controls, right? So this is a process where you assess your environment. What are my risks, right? And what to do about it, right? How can I minimize my risks, right? What are the threats that are out there, right? Are they being actively being exploited, right? What controls do I have in place, right? what are my assets? Are they being protected, right? So the other way to look at it is what happens if my assets are compromised? What happens if this application goes down? What do we stand to lose? Is it money? Is it revenue? Is it reputation? Is it just a service disruption? What is it, right? So that is the question you have to ask yourself and understand, right? Because the law, again, the laws can come in many shape and form, right? So this program will give everybody a better understanding of the threats that exist, right? The ways they can be exploited, right? And it'll also tell you how effective your controls are, right? So hopefully you can identify any gap that may exist and maybe fix any misconfiguration, right? So they also establish a baseline that feature assessments can use to determine whether planned improvements have occurred, right? So interesting stat there, 60% of the breach victims said they were breached due to an unpatched known vulnerability where the patch was not applied. So to make, what makes it worse is that people were just being complacent, right? They're not, the patches were, they simply did not keep up with the updates, right? So that is one of the main ways you can secure your system, just simply by keeping those systems up to date. I mean, obviously, when we think about improved security, we think about layered security, right? Making it very difficult for the bad guys, by putting controls at many layers. But patching your system is pretty basic. It should be a routine thing. It's not a project, right? You have to get used to that, right? So simply keep your systems up to date, and by simply doing that, you can hugely improve your security posture. And by doing that, you actually reduce your risk by significantly, right? Simply by keeping your systems up to date. So I'll look at some of the tools there. So the NIST special publication 800-40 says, from a security perspective, patches are most often of interest because they are mitigating software flaw vulnerabilities. Applying patches to eliminate these vulnerabilities significantly reduces the opportunities for exploitation. So again, just to reiterate, right, as things age, right, they become more vulnerable because bad guys are constantly researching, right? So the older the software is, the chances are more exploits exist for that software. And you can nullify some of that by keep your systems and software up to date. So interestingly, it's not always a software patch that can handle a vulnerability, right? Oftentimes it is patch, a software update, but sometimes it could be a configuration change as well. So in the case of using weak password, right? So there's no patch for that, right? It's just a basic cybersecurity hygiene, right? Simply use a strong strong password, right? So simply by changing your password, you can improve your security posture. And also look for any misconfiguration, right? So most vendors provide best practices guide, right? So if you're not sure, read those documents, right? And make sure that your systems are following those best practices. So as I mentioned, right, asset management is a challenge in many organizations, right? Small organizations, large organizations, because over time, things get more complex. You install more systems, you acquire more tools and technologies. So unless you have a good grip on this, over time it becomes a challenge, right? So you absolutely have to know what you have, and this is fundamental. If you're going to start a formal a vulnerability management program, and it's also important for many other cybersecurity things as well. So once you have an idea of what you actually have, so this is a report this is a sample report that you can generate once you know what you have, right? So for example, this one tells you the number of, I don't know, Linux systems and Apple systems you have, right? Systems with Adobe installed, other software, right? So these are interesting stats, right? It's good. So this depicts your environment. This gives you an idea of what you have in your environment, right? But you can only get this meaningful dashboard if you have an idea of your network, of the scope of your network, right? Are you scanning them, right? If you're not, once you start scanning your network and all the assets, then you can start to get meaningful dashboards such as this one, right? So obviously this is pretty insightful, right? So based on this, you can take actions, right? And you can start drilling down to those numbers and look at the specifics, for example. So to give you an to give you an example, what can be done with this report. So let's say you don't want to allow Wireshark in your network, right? For whatever reason. So because now you have the knowledge of which systems has Wireshark, so that number happens to be 462, right? So this light blue one, right? So you can target those 462 systems, and simply remove Wireshark, right? Because whatever reason we need to get rid of Wireshark, you can, right? Or you can say, oh, you know what, we are going to allow Wireshark, but it has to be upgraded to the latest version, right? So these are the things that that are very doable, but you have to start with the basic, that is discovering all of your assets, right? So once you discover your assets, you can start organizing them. You can start to group them based on their various attributes, properties, whatever software version they use, based on OS, and bunch of other things, right? So it's about collecting the data first, right? And then you can figure out, okay, now we can start to generate various kinds of reports, because now we have the data, right? So it's super important to know what you have, so that way you can build a meaningful report, and based on those reports, you can take action. So resource is a constraint everywhere, right? Any organization you go to, resource is always a challenge, right? There's also technical challenges too. But what's important to understand is threats are closer. Challenges are real, but threats are closer. So at some point, you just have to be prepared, right? All of us will be compromised at some point. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, right? So what we try to do is minimize that possibility, right? So minimize the risk, right? So this is why we talk about backup and adding additional security controls, so that the compromise, the so-called compromise, will be much more challenging for the bad guy, right? Because so think about that home analogy, right? If your door is open, right, in your house, that's likely to attract anybody, because the door is open, right? Now, if you're security conscious and you shut the door, okay, so now instead of attracting just literally everybody, it'll attract maybe, let's say, 5 individuals, right? Because they want to check out your house. Now, let's say you install, I don't know, 3 locks, right? So now getting to your house just became a bit harder, right? So of the 5 people now, right, let's say 3 of them will just simply give up. You know what? The door is locked. I'm not even going to bother, right? Let me just move on to the next one. Let's say the remaining 2 other are pretty determined, right? They don't really care, right? They're going to try to break the door, pick the lock, or do something about it, right? So, just by doing that, right, we've reduced our risk from letting everybody into our house to just 2 guys, right? So while this is still a concern, we have minimized the risk a bit, right? So that's what we try to do, right? Make it harder for the bad guys, so that majority of them are actually filtered out, and we just deal with the remaining ones, right? So because of layered security controls, we make it even harder for them, right? So now let's say they're still outside, right? So in that scenario, they don't know what's inside the house, right? So let's say I installed a security alarm system, right? So if the door is open, the alarm will go off, and that'll make an automated call to the police, right? And they'll be there in a couple of minutes, right? So those are the control, security controls that I have implemented, for example, right? So it just became very, very challenging for the bad guys, right? But because they were determined, they were able to break my door and come in. But because I had that alarm set up, they were pretty much caught, right? So that is the same principle we try to apply in security also, by having controls at multiple layers, right? So that it's not just very super easy for the bad guys, right? We have to think of security as a holistically, right? So timing, prioritization, testing, right? So those are a few of the main concerns, right? Also, you need a robust tool to manage the patches, right? Meaning how to push software update, how to configure them, scheduling them, and also, because of the growing usage of all different kinds of devices, BYOD, virtual systems, security solution became much more complex, right? So this is why it's important to kind of maintain a standard in your organization so that you can easily address these security concerns, right? So you can fairly easily push updates because your systems are pretty much consistent, right? If you have to maintain 20 different configuration, that administratively that will be very, very challenging. So try to remain some level of consistency, right? It's not going to be perfect, but there's going to be some it's going to be a bit easier if you maintain some sort of consistency, right? Some kind of unification. If you are going to distribute a bunch of machines or off premise, make sure there's some kind of agent on them so that whenever they connect to the network to the internet, they'll check into the console and you have some visibility there, right? Again, so inventory is a big thing, right? So asset management, it's going to show up several times because it is that important. Resource overload, installation side effects, patch management, verification, application whitelisting. So application whitelisting is very, very, good security control, because what that essentially does is that it'll take something like a snapshot of your system and kind of like freeze that, right? Because other than those whitelisted application, anything foreign or anything that's new will be denied execution, right? So that is a pretty good security control, but it requires a lot of testing, validation, and understanding and the management aspect of it, right? So if you are going to push updates, right, they need to be in sync. That means let's say if you're going to push updates at 10 p.m. at night, you need to configure your whitelisting solution so that at 10 p.m. at night, it will allow the software management to run. Otherwise, even though it's legitimate software update, it will be rejected, right? So it's something to consider and keep in mind so that your configuration and the timing is in sync, right? So whitelisting is typically used for outdated operating systems, so that this is not ideal, but it somewhat protects your system much better, because like I said, anything new it'll reject, right? So some other common pitfalls, again, as you can see, software asset management is a problem, right? If people don't read. So ideally, whatever vendor products that you have, you want to definitely sign up for their advisories, right? So whenever these vulnerabilities are released, vendor will typically send out blast emails to their customers. So you need to explicitly sign up for this kind of advisories so that you can be informed right away. So vendors will typically describe what it is, what the concern is, and what you can do in the meantime. So typically vendors will also provide some kind of workaround or give you an idea of when the patch might come out, right? So definitely it's very important to look at, sign up for these advisories. Failure to prioritize vulnerabilities according to the exposure and risk level they create for the organization. And that's, pretty basic, right? First, understanding the value of your asset, right? And then prioritizing what's worth more, right? So because when something is worth more, you can imagine that'll be targeted more often as well, just because of the value, right? So as such, that also requires more protection, right? This one is a very common one, right? And as you can see from this slide here, the 60% of the breaches, right? And this is the reason why, because people don't really pay attention to the patches, and simply by patching your systems, you can reduce the risk significantly, right? So it's very important to keep your systems up to date. Obviously avoid using or move away from using outdated hardware, software, and legacy system that cannot tolerate patching, because eventually vendors will drop support, right? Large vendors tend to support products for a while, but this is a big challenge for smaller companies, right? So small companies make product, and sometimes they go out of business a couple of years later, and obviously there's no more patching. So if you are in that kind of situation, think about an alternative, right? Or if that's not an option, you need to lock down the security. But in the long term, you still have to think about some kind of migration plan, because while this is a temporary workaround, it cannot be run forever, right? So it's important to think about think strategically. Lack of standards, right? So maintain some kind of consistency, right? So that it's easier for you to target and patch, right? So when you have too many iterations of or combinations of hardware and software, we have to test for compatibility. It just becomes a more of a challenge, and things are delayed, right? So things that should take you, let's say, 2 weeks, now will take you 5 weeks because of all this different kind of testing with different hardware, software combination. So you cannot push those patches in a timely manner, right? So it'll just delay your patching deployment, and by doing that, you're actually increased your risk exposure, because now during that time, your systems can be potentially attacked, right? Another common mistake is failure to test patches, right? So people just, sometimes people just do push patches into the production environment, and that could potentially cause harm, right? And it has happened many times. And because of that one incident, right, people just develop a bad feeling for patches and say, you know what, no more patching. And that's a terrible thing, right? Because that will then make your system more vulnerable, right? So this is why it's important to plan, test, right, rather than just pushing the updates. You need to work with the stakeholders, understand the systems, do proper testing, and push the patch, right? Monitoring is a big part of this, right? So far we talked about all the problems, right? What about the solution, right? So any security initiative, has to be supported by top leadership, right? So this is the perfect case for trickling down, right? For this to be successful, you absolutely have to have support from the top management, right? Because they can allocate sufficient resources, right? Which is one of the challenge. You need to check with the vendors and follow their best practices guidelines, and you continuously monitor your program, right? So far we talked about why it matters, right? So now how to do it, right? So this is how you can implement this program, right? So start and categorize your assets. Again, emphasis on the asset management. You have to understand what hardware you have, software, whether it's on-prem or cloud, right? So once you understand that, you can group them. You can understand the value, right? And then you ask yourself the question of the business risk, right? So what happens if this application goes down? What happens if that system goes down? And how does it interrupt the company, right? And then once you have those understanding, now you start to actually scan for vulnerabilities, right? So that is done with some tools, and I'll show you that. So a scanning tool will actually probe your environment and tell you what's wrong with it, right? Whether it's running old version or there's a misconfiguration somewhere. So these are great tools that can probe your systems and give you a report. So once you get the report, again, relating to the prioritization, you can decide, okay, what to address first, right? Whether it's by asset or severity, right? So typically these reports will have different classifications like critical, high, medium, and low, right? So based on the resources that you at your disposal and other factors, you can decide what to address first, right? So yeah, and then you want to think from a hacker's perspective, right? So if you were the bad guy, what would you attack first and why, right? I will attack this application because it's very old, it's never been patched, right? I'll be more successful that way. Or do I want to attack something that's that is well protected, right? So try to think from that perspective as well, right? So again, if the door is open, anybody could just walk in without too much effort, right? But if the door is shut, it's locked, then it's going to require more efforts, right? So that will deter most of the people, right? It's only the determined ones that will try to break in, right? So same thing here, right? When your assets are well protected with multiple controls at different layers, it'll be kind of harder to attack. It's still possible, but it'll be harder, right? So once you have the report, you want to obviously remediate, right? That is the whole objective, how to fix it, right? So remediate, and then the last step is validation, right? Is it really working? Have we successfully pushed the updates? Have we remediated the vulnerabilities that were reported earlier, right? So this is why it's a cycle of thing, right? It's not just doing this one-time activity. This is not a one-time activity. This is a recurring thing, right? So what most companies do is they set up scan on a regular basis, like bi-weekly, monthly, or something like that. And usually after patch deployment, you'd schedule your scanning, right? So that way the changes will be reflected, right? So you want to time it that way. So how to develop this plan, right? Define and document. First you have to plan it well, right? Think about how think about the metrics that will be used for to measure the effectiveness of this program. Think about the training, right? Who needs training? Is it the technical staff, or the users, or the administrators, right? What level of training is required? Think about the documentation, right? Determine the tools aligned to the strategy. So you may want to evaluate some of the tools. For vulnerability management, there are a bunch of different tools, including open source as well as commercial ones. They're really great. You want to think about some of the sources for this kind of vulnerability information, right? So somebody who will actually tell you what's wrong with your system, right? What is my source? Where do you get this information, right? Does this magically appear, or I can go somewhere to get this information? Clearly defining roles and responsibilities. Who is going to do what? The last thing you want is finger pointing. So it's very important for teams to understand what their roles are, who's going to run the scan, who's going to be in charge of actually rolling out the patches, right? And then who is going to do the validation afterwards, right? So this is why you have to engage all the stakeholders, right? And after you develop the plan, obviously everything can be improved, right? Just like everything in life, right? There's always a better way of doing things. So periodically, you want to review this whole process and see what you can do better, right? Additionally, you want to read upon CIS critical security controls, right? There's high emphasis on inventory and asset management, and then secure configuration, right? Once you have your assets, are they well configured, right? Restricting ports and continuously checking for vulnerability. So here are some possible resources where you can go sign up for the newsletters. They will actually send you emails as soon as vulnerabilities are discovered with very useful information. So vendors should be your first choice. Anything that you use from a specific vendor, you definitely want to sign up for their newsletters, so that way you can be better informed and stay ahead of the game. You can sign up for different newsletters from DHS, the Infraguard, a bunch of other resources. So here are some potential tools that you can use. Obviously, this is not a complete list. This is some of the market leaders, including some of the open source one. Greenbone, I believe, is the open source here. These are very good tools, right? So how do these tools work, right? So typically, they scan you, probe your network. It's agentless. You want to make sure that your system, your vulnerability manager can access all of your network, right? Agents is available, especially for remote laptops, right? So scan is a scheduled activity that occurs, once or twice a month, right? You can do different profiles, right? So you can do a basic discovery scan, which will just tell you, what you have on your network. It's not a detailed scan. Okay, so you want to make sure your scan database is up to date, because they, like everything else, they also need to be updated. And if you have other tools that you can integrate with, you should definitely do that. Because that way, your tools will give you better value, right? By having that integration with other tools, it'll help you, everybody really. So this is a sample report that you can expect to see after you set up your tool, right? Very colorful. It'll show you numbers based on vulnerability based on the OS, however you want to see it, right? This is very useful, and this gives you actionable intelligence, right? So the next thing we want to make sure is the accuracy, right? So the numbers are great, right? It's one thing to get those numbers, but it's a whole different other thing to digest and understand those numbers better. So ideally, our objective is remediation, right? So that is addressing the root cause and fixing the problem permanently. Sometimes there's a mitigation mechanism, which is usually a temporary workaround until a permanent fix is available, right? So vendors will often suggest, change this configuration or that configuration until we release a full patch for this, right? So remediation should be the first preference. It's important to verify the accuracy of the report, right? You don't want anything misleading. So this includes, checking your Active Directory for stale objects, because pretty much everything syncs with Active Directory, right? So if the Active Directory is not cleaned up, your numbers will be pretty much inflated as well. Right, so it's very important to keep your Active Directory cleaned as much as possible. Then it's a question of, is it based on authenticated scan, right? So think about this. If you're standing outside of my house, you can pretty much just see the shape of the house, right? But you don't know what's inside the house, right? So it's the same concept here. Once you run authenticated scan, it will be much more meaningful and much more detailed, because now it can log into the system and give you much more accurate, much better results, right? Also, when you look at reports, you want to make sure you have the DNS names as well as IP addresses. And that's also another common challenge in many places where systems will be reported with just IP address. And as you know, that's a challenge, because if I'm just looking at an IP address, I have no idea what that is, right? I need to see a name, right? If the name is missing, so that means that probably that indicates the DNS record is probably missing. So in my view, anything that touches your network, it should have a DNS record. Again, asset management, does it cover all of your assets, right? And again, thinking about roles and responsibilities, somebody has to do something about this thing, right? So are you sending these reports to appropriate individuals, right, who can then take action, right? Ultimately, something should be done about this, right? Okay, so as you start to digest these reports, there are two other different especially CVSS metrics that tells you the severity of that vulnerability, right? So anything critical, high, medium, you want to address right away. The CVE number is just really a reference point. This is a format CVE dash the year, right? So as you start to analyze your report, you can have a policy that states, okay, anything that's critical, it should be remediated within 7 days. And 7 days is just a placeholder, right? It could be 14 days based on your organization policies, right? So you want to analyze for relevance, determine for responsibilities, and minimize false positives, right? Because at the end of the day, if the input is good, the output is going to be as accurate also, right? If your input is not as good, that means your output is going to be as such. Right? So at this point, you have a successful program set up, right? How to validate that, right? How do you know that you are actually doing a great job, right? So these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself, right? Are we doing a good job? Is this program working for us, right? What percentage of our assets are recovering in our scan, right? How often are we pushing updates? Are they being successful, right? And how do you validate that? So some of those questions and some numbers to understand, right? So these are some of the very good metrics to determine the success of your program.
So my sincere apology for interrupting you, sir. We have running out of time, so you have only 4 or 5 minutes left. So hopefully you can wrap up.
Yes, thank you. I'm actually near the completion of the presentation. Thank you. So yes, so these are the steps that you can follow, to start this program. Create a plan, understand your environment, deploy it, right? Keep yourself up to date, and then once you get the report, you want to assess and mitigate those vulnerabilities and set standards, right? And continuously monitor, right? So that's very important, right? Okay, so I am actually wrapping up here. At the end, I have some very good resources when it comes to vulnerability management. So you can definitely take a look at that. So I would like to take a question. I think we just have a minute or two. Any question? Okay, I see a question. So you can start with the Greenbone. That is an open source free tool. Rapid7 and Tenable also has a limited free version. So you can play with those. That'll be a good start. But definitely look into Greenbone. That's a free tool.